Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Natural Areas Association webinar today. Let us know where you're logging in from, so go ahead and type that into the chat box. We're going to be using chat today to ask our presenter questions, so go ahead and practice using it now by telling us where you're logging in from. We've got Philip from Cincinnati, Ohio. We've got Christine from Asheville, North Carolina. Something that's been fun here lately is seeing people type in very specifically here. We've got somebody sitting at their kitchen table in Pittsburgh. So if you want to be that specific and tell us specifically where you're logging in from, we'd be happy to know that. We had some people sitting on porches and sitting in vehicles during our webinar last week, which was fun to see. Some folks were with their kids, some folks were with their dogs. Oh, there's somebody with their kitten. We've got people from all over the US, Colorado, California, North Carolina, Oregon, Washington, Ohio, Louisiana. We've got somebody in Ontario, Tennessee, Martha's Vineyard. Somebody's having breakfast, somebody's at their breakfast nook in Fayetteville, Arkansas, Maryland, somebody from Hawaii, Texas, Kentucky, Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Missouri, Oregon. So people from all over the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, yeah. Arkansas, Indiana, Massachusetts, continue to log in and test that chat function by telling us where you're logging in from. There is Diana, is on her living room couch in Minnesota. Joshua is in Elmira at home with his kids. So continue to log in and test out test out that chat function. There's somebody from West by God, Virginia with us, which is great. Good to have you here. Lots of people joining us. We're at 339 participants. Just going to give folks a minute more to log in and get settled. Folks from Florida, Tennessee, Colorado, California, Alabama, New Jersey, Connecticut, Albany, New York. This is really fun, all over the United States and even beyond. Oh, it looks like Ed at Comstock Seed and Aiden are collecting IDIQ seeds, which is fun. Thanks for taking a break to be with us. Folks from Georgia, North Dakota, Maryland, Idaho, Arizona, exclamation point. Lincoln, Nebraska. Come on in, try out that chat function. Happy that you could join us. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Sarah. I work with the Natural Areas Association. I'm really happy that you could join us today and be part of today's webinar. It's a special webinar that we're bringing you today. I'm just going to say a little bit about the Natural Areas Association. We are over 40 years old. We're a member-supported nonprofit organization, and our mission is to train, connect, and advocate for natural areas professionals. We support natural areas professionals in conservation and natural areas management by bringing you the latest science and best practices. And we do that through multiple venues, one of which is our webinars like this one, the Natural Areas Journal, which is a quarterly peer-reviewed publication, regional workshops that we host all over the United States, and the annual Natural Areas Conference, which again, we host every year all over the United States in different locations. I'd encourage you to visit our website, naturalareas.org, and talk to one of our members, one of your colleagues who's a member of ours, to learn more about what we do. We're really excited to connect with you and welcome you to this webinar, and just invite you to join us, learn more about what we do, and connect with your colleagues through us. We have a bunch of upcoming events. I'll just start by saying that we have a video archive of last week's webinar available on our website. That was a webinar on a couple of restoration case studies that were published in the January issue of the Natural Areas Journal, so you can access that video. Again, it's an hour-long webinar video that's available for free through our website, naturalareas.org. We have another webinar coming up next month May 19th, we'll be hosting 3 speakers talking about the use of goat grazing in invasive species control. This is also research by Catherine Marchetto that was published in the Natural Areas Journal just this month, in this month's issue. So we invite you to join us next month. We are moving forward with the Natural Areas Conference. We are planning to hold the conference, and we encourage you to stay in touch with us. Check the website for updates as we move forward with planning, even in light of the global pandemic. So, having introduced you to our organization, NAA has been involved with Plant Conservation Alliance partners for the last 5 years to advance the work that they do, specifically in the National Seed Strategy. And we support the use of native plants, native seed and native plants in natural areas restoration and conservation. We are pleased to have with us today the committee doing a national assessment on native seeds with the National Academy of Sciences. And we really want to make sure that our members and our partners' needs for seeds, native seeds, are taken into account as a part of this assessment. So we're glad, again, that you're able to join us and contribute your knowledge, contribute your input to this important study. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our webinar speaker for today, Dr. Susan Harrison. Susan is a distinguished professor at the University of California, Davis, and she chairs the committee assessing native seed needs and capacities with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Susan Harris.
So hi, everybody. It's really very exciting to be talking to you. I have to admit that I have never before given so much as an online lecture. Of course, I've lately been participating in a lot of Zoom meetings, but to be talking to hundreds of people all over the country is a pretty exciting new experience. And it's a real honor to be talking to a group of people who are involved in, who all of you, I assume, are involved in many diverse ways in managing natural areas for conservation. So I hope you're all doing well and finding ways to continue your important work and stay happy during the period that we're living through right now. I am happy to report that I'm staying both, busy and I guess somewhat productive during this time, and also getting out to exercise a lot. So nothing to complain about personally. Anyhow, I'm here, of course, on behalf of the National Academy's committee to assess the nation's native seed needs and capacities, as Sarah has already told you. And the whole committee is very excited about the opportunity for us to reach out to you, members of the Natural Areas Association, and tell us about what we're doing, because this is a really timely moment, as I'll explain in our process, where reaching out and generating interest from the restoration community and getting your input at a time when it can really influence what we're doing is just a really tremendous opportunity. So we want to thank the Natural Areas Association and Lisa and Sarah for making this possible. And of course, again, thank you for attending. And in the spirit of wanting to know who my audience is and reaching out to you and trying to make some connection, even though all I've seen are your names flicking up on the screen, I just wanted to start by pointing out, let's see if I can, that slide did not advance. There we go. That a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, Peggy Olwell from the Bureau of Land Management and others gave a webinar to this audience on the National Seed Strategy. And so this is very much a predecessor to the study committee that we're embarking on now. And it's, in fact, as you'll see, another step in the process that was initiated by the National Seed Strategy. So again, wanting to get to know you, I prepared a little poll of 5 questions, very simple questions, and you're going to soon see a poll pop up on your screen so that you can vote. And I just want to know a few things about you. And I guess at the same time, we'll get to know things, you'll all get to know things about each other. So the first question is, did anybody here attend that seminar 2.5 years ago by, again, Peggy Olwell and others describing progress on the National Seed Strategy? And the second question is, even if you didn't attend that seminar, whether or not you did, whether you're familiar with the National Seed Strategy. I keep having the poll pop up in the middle of my slides, so it's a little bit distracting, but not a problem. Third question, I'd like to know kind of how our audience today falls out among the different sectors that are involved in restoration and in natural lands management. So please, if you will, click one of those boxes, whichever one you think applies best to you, as to which sector you're from or you represent. And there's no right or wrong answers. So the answer to how you should answer the question is however you feel you should answer the question. And then the fourth question is whether you belong to what our committee is loosely referring to as the native seed user communities. That is, are you involved in community? Are you involved in doing restoration, and are you involved in some way in procuring native plant materials for restoration? Again, if you feel like the answer is yes, then it's yes. However you like to answer that is fine, but we'd like to know how many people out there are potentially challenged by this, this task of obtaining native plant materials for restoration. And then the final question, are you one of what our committee loosely calls the native seed supply community? Do you grow seeds? Do you collect seeds? Do you provide seeds to either your own organization or others for use in restoration? So that's just by way of trying to find out who you are out there, because it would be helpful for us to know who we've reached. And it's just helpful for me as a speaker to know a little bit. So now, Sarah is going to watch the poll. You should all have the poll in front of you, and Sarah will watch the poll results come in. And when they're complete, we'll have a look. So it looks like only a few people attended the seminar, webinar a few years ago, but you can still attend it. You can go online and find it and listen to Peggy and others talk about the native seed strategy, which it looks like most of you are familiar with. So that's nice. Looks like we have people from many different sectors. So that's also exciting. And now, seed users are 90% of the audience. I'm glad to see that. We're reaching the people that we want to reach. And it's also exciting that many of you are also seed suppliers. So thanks, everybody. Okay, the chat box is just popping up with lots of verbal answers to those questions. Shall we move on? Sarah, do you have any more feedback on the poll, or should we just continue?
I think let's continue. We can take a closer look at those results later on.
Yeah, okay, maybe we can post them somewhere where people can look at them if they're interested. Okay, so getting back to, let's see, come on here. The native seeds, the National Seed Strategy for Rehabilitation and Restoration was launched in 2015 in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, which of course was in 2012. And I believe it was catalyzed by some emergency funding that resulted from Hurricane Sandy. And it was in recognition of, in the wake of that hurricane and other more recent, very large natural events, that it is really hard to provide the necessary plant materials to do the kind of restoration that's needed in the wake of these events. So in addition to all the many ongoing restoration needs having to do with commonplace, everyday, all too familiar land degradation and disturbance activities, there's also this perception that there's going to be an increasing need for very large scale rehabilitation and restoration after events like Sandy and other hurricanes, after events like the mega fires that have occurred in the Great Basin and elsewhere. And that providing the right seed, as the vision of the native seed strategy is, the right seed in the right place at the right time. And of course, the whole purpose of having a strategy is the recognition that this is not an easy problem to solve. It's not the bottom line here, and the reason for the existence of our committee is this is a market in which we hope that supply will meet demand, but there are many challenges for that to happen. And addressing those challenges is our purpose. And in fact, there is a document from, I think now 2018 called Making Progress that reports on the steps that have been taken so far under the National Seed Strategy. And so you can have a look at this document yourself. It's readily available online. So the goals are pretty straightforward. First, to kind of evaluate, identify the needs and the obstacles to a reliable supply of native seed. Second, to conduct the kinds of research that are needed on things like the existence of seed zones and also the existence of techniques for seed production and for restoration implementation itself. and then to develop decision-making tools and to develop communication tools. Those are the 4 broad goals of the strategy. And our committee basically exists pursuant to achieving goal 1. It's our job under a 2-year contract with the Bureau of Land Management to evaluate what we're calling the native seed enterprise or the native seed supply chain, and to identify it and study it a bit quantitatively and try to understand what some of the issues and problems in that supply chain or that enterprise might be. So the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or the National Academy for short, is a body of independent scientific advisors to the nation. It exists in order to produce reports that give the best available scientific analysis of important societal problems that are needed by policymakers, essentially. And as you can see from this lovely slide that was provided to me by the National Academies, it was signed into existence by President Lincoln during the Civil War, and it has existed ever since as a place where policymakers can turn during those rare moments when they need good scientific advice to drive their decision making. And it's considered a prestigious thing to serve on one of these committees. And so generally when people are asked, even if they're very busy, even if they're the top expert in their field with lots of other demands on their time, they will generally say yes. And the reports that are produced by these groups have a high reputation for being credible, balanced, objective. Even when dealing with highly inflammatory issues, they are seldom, to my knowledge, ever attacked for being partisan, because there's a great attempt to make it the kind of the last word based on available evidence on some subject of public relevance. So it was kind of a natural thing for the BLM, with some of its funding, to turn to the National Academy to do the definitive report on the status of the nation's seed supply. So our statement of task that constituted this committee asks us to assess federal, state, tribal, and private sector needs and capacity, in other words, demand and supply, for native plant seeds for ecological restoration and other purposes. Why would this be done? Why would such a report be needed? Well, there's the sense that there is this very complex thing out there, the native seed enterprise or supply chain, with many, many parts to it, which all interact with one another. We don't know the sizes of the geographic distribution or much else quantitatively about this system. We know it's very big and very complex. And to get it to work better and to get demand to meet supply better is going to first require just characterizing it and then identifying some of the bottlenecks. And then ultimately, of course, the goal is for our committee to be able to make recommendations to improve the supply of native seed. And I will use language taken directly from the National Seed Strategy. The real focus is on what the strategy calls, quote, genetically appropriate native seed. And that is defined in the seed strategy. You can read the definition for yourself, but it involves things like the seeds being appropriately adapted to the locations in which they're going to be used. Also being genetically diverse enough to tolerate future changes such as climate change. Also being diverse enough in terms of species to support the functions of a relatively healthy native ecosystem. And so all of those aspects go into their definition of genetically appropriate. So I'm not using that term as a value judgment, but rather taking it directly from some of our constituting document. And I want to point out that this is not an original idea with our committee or with the BLM to analyze the problems of native seed supply for restoration. It's a well-recognized problem, and there have been other studies similar in general scope to ours, or similar in intent in terms of the problems they're looking at. One was this Rockefeller Foundation report of a couple of years ago on challenges in supplying native plants for resilience projects. Another was a major report which has just come out in Australia assessing exactly the same problems as we're looking at. How to better enable demand to meet supply for seeds for the very, very big demands of restoration in Australia. And then there's been work in the academic sector as well, or the kind of academic applied crossover sector. For example, analyzing these issues in Chile or these issues in the Colorado Plateau. So we're certainly not the first to notice that this is a complex market with some real problems or real challenges to get supply, much of which is from the private sector, to meet demand, which comes from both very complicated private and public sectors of native seed users. But will be the first ones to do this at a US-wide scope. What will make our study different from these predecessors is it has a nationwide scope, trying to cover all the sectors that produce and use native seeds, and trying to do so with a kind of a quantitative depth and rigor that is associated with a National Academy study. And here's our committee. I won't go through everyone on a blow-by-blow basis, but it's a mixture of academic scientists, retired members of agencies who have worked with restoration and seed supply issues, several agricultural economists who are essential to understanding how the system works, and several people who bring to bear quantitative skills on how to conduct and analyze survey information, because we will be doing sort of a formal information gathering process as part of our effort. So it's a great committee and a great pleasure to work with. And here's our study process with green highlighting to tell you where we are at right now. We are coming to the end of phase 1, where we have met now 3 times. We've done our sort of our background research. We've had some meetings to scope out the problem and forge a strategy for moving forward. And our strategy for moving forward is known as our interim report. And we are just now in some of the later drafts of our interim report, and it will soon be reviewed and ultimately released. And the interim report is intended to define the problem more specifically and to present a strategy for information gathering, which will be both formal surveys and more informal sort of interview type information gathering. And we would like that information gathering part to begin fairly soon. So by reaching out to you at this point, we are making our first tentative steps toward catching this fledgling interim report. In other words, we're identifying you as a very valuable group of constituents that you may be seeing surveys from us, or you may be receiving other kinds of communications as we move into the formal information gathering. And then ultimately, when the surveys and other information gathering are finished and analyzed, we'll prepare the final report, including recommendations, and it will be reviewed hopefully a little less than a year from now. And after being reviewed, will be released and publicized and presented to Congress with the hope that perhaps there could be some valuable outcomes that will affect restoration in a positive way. There's a few slides about just some of the general things that we've learned so far. And for this, I had to borrow a figure from the Rockefeller Foundation report, since we don't have our own figures yet, although we will. And this is just to illustrate, using the Rockefeller Foundation's material, that it is a really complex system, or a complex supply chain with many, many, many parts. And this is only one of about 12 similar diagrams that this report used to illustrate the totality of the chain of native seed supply and use. And this particular illustration is meant to illustrate some of the problems, in this case, the kind of the time lag mismatch between a product, a biological product that is produced by biological processes that have an annual timescale, a product that's also perishable, a product that also has to be tailored to the specific place where it's going to be used, how that meets a demand that has also its own peculiarities that can be very erratic and very unpredictable and so on. So this is just one little glimpse of the very complex beast that is the supply chain. I can't imagine that this isn't a lot more complicated than, say, the supply chain for toilet paper, which we've all now recently discovered has its flaws too. Another very general thing that we've learned, one of the complexities, is that there are many different kinds of users of native seed in this country. We think most readily about ecological restoration as defined by entities like the Society for Ecological Restoration, where the starting point is a natural ecosystem, usually a wildland setting that's been damaged in some way. And the goal is to put back as much as possible of the species that were there before the disturbance. So if you think of that as kind of the narrow sense meaning of ecological restoration, there's certainly a lot of that going on. But there's also many, many uses of native seeds that are a little more focused toward more specific ecosystem services, usually because of funding or regulatory realities that prioritize particular types of services. Of course, the most classic one and perhaps most important one quantitatively is just physical site stabilization. Wetlands after hurricanes or steep hillsides after fires, et cetera. There's a lot of seed that's used with the primary purpose of just stabilizing a site. There's also many other types of uses, whether it's supporting pollinator populations, preventing reinvasion of invasive species after they've been controlled, stormwater mitigation, wildlife habitat. You know the scoop. I mean, you people are all land managers. You know all the diverse kinds of ways that people use native plants to achieve specific goals. There's also a lot of non-wildlands uses where the goal may not be to get anything that resembles a natural ecosystem, but rather to provide beautification, drought-tolerant landscaping, oftentimes in urban settings. The use of native plants is becoming more and more popular. And there are also the more traditional uses that fall within the domain of market economics, like livestock grazing, for which many acres are planted after overgrazing or other types of disturbance. So this is just a very quick snapshot of the complexity and the variety of kinds of use that comprise the demand side of the native seed system. And going along with that diversity of use is the diversity in the kinds of seeds that are used for those purposes. One of the issues that we've perhaps talked the most about in this regard is the distinction between, and I will acknowledge right here that there's some terminology issues, but just to give you a sort of a simple account of it, I'll use the term source identified versus cultivated native seed, where source identified is either directly collected from the wild and just used, or collected from the wild and then grown out to increase it, but with a strong desire to avoid any kind of selection and to identify it as to its source so that it can then be used in ecologically appropriate locations. So if that's one end of the continuum, then the other is seeds that represent native species, but that have been deliberately subjected to cultivation and perhaps to crossbreeding and so on to give them what are considered to be desirable properties, as well as just the accidental selection that could take place because of many generations of cultivation. So there's a lot of dialogue in the native seed user community about the relative merits of that more wild type product, the source identified seeds, versus the more farmed and cultivated types of seeds. I'll leave it at that. There's also issues that are relevant to our committee about the use of non-native species versus natives, and that may seem shocking or it may not, depending on where you work, I suppose. But let's just say that there are users of native seeds who do not exclusively use native seeds. They may, depending on circumstances, including funding, including timing, who knows what other considerations go into it, they may decide to substitute non-natives for natives for some of those same purposes talked about in the last slide. And we need to understand that, because that is an activity that affects the degree and reliability of demand for native seeds. Issues that we haven't talked about as much, but I think are also really important when we think about the quality and the price and the availability of native seeds as they relate to our task, are what steps are people taking to ensure genetic diversity in their native seed stocks so that they're not only adapted to local present conditions, but have some chance of being able to adapt to local future conditions. Then there's also the issue of species diversity, not just genetic diversity. It's very common, we've found, especially in large projects, to rely on a few species that are available and reliable, but then you might miss out on some of the ecological functions provided by species that are less available. So we're wrestling with these questions, and a specific issue that we've talked about is whether there's a kind of a substitution going on where there would be a better market for native seed if certain users weren't so readily substituting non-native seed, for example. The scale of use is very diverse, of course. There are huge projects that use tens or even 100,000 pounds of seed, and others that are very small. So as we're putting our economist hats on, there's different ways that those large users and small users can affect one another. The large users might stabilize the market or destabilize the market. with respect to the small users, depending on some of their some of the properties of their demand, let's say. For example, some of the large uses also are rather urgent and unplanned ones, like very large plantings of grass in the Great Basin after very large fires. These reactive types of projects might be viewed as sort of destabilizing because they're unplanned, and then all the seed that's available of a particular species could be used up in 1 year by one particular user, which rather than supplying a robust market that benefits everybody else, could compete with those other users. So we want to try to understand if that's the case, and just understand more about the relationship between the more and less planned types of uses as they affect the market. Ultimately, as I said, the goal of all of this is not just to study a problem, but to suggest solutions. And I want to be very clear here that we have no recommendations, no conclusions, not even provisional conclusions yet. So what I've given here are just my own examples of the types of things toward which we might ultimately be working. We might end up recommending that there are aspects of support by the public sector, let's say, for collection, seed banking, and warehousing of seeds that could really help the private sector function better to meet demand. There might be better contracting tools that will take some of the risk away from the private growers and make them more willing to supply some of these more difficult to supply seeds to buyers from whatever sector. There might be recommendations we can make, and I think these would be particularly targeted toward public sector users, that would incentivize them to create a steadier demand for genetically appropriate seeds rather than a more fluctuating demand and a more substitutable demand that we see now. So these are the kinds of things that we hope to be able to recommend ultimately, but again, that's down the road. So just wrapping this up here. Again, I think the fun and value of this talk is going to come very much from the question and answer part. So I want to leave some time for that. But I would like to know from you, if you're involved in restoration in some form, if you're the planner or implementer of restoration in some way, based on your agency's mission or your organization's profile, whatever, do you place a very high value on using these so-called genetically appropriate materials? Do you pay attention to seeds that come from the right seed zone, that are identified such, that are species diverse in terms of the number of species you use, et cetera? But I guess mainly it's what I'm getting at here is the source identified issue. Do you really care a lot about kind of local species with locally adapted genetics? Is that a big deal or a moderate to non-issue for you? And then depending on your answer to this question, I'd really be interested in just knowing how much this issue of seed supply affects you. Is it your perception that obtaining the seeds that you need at a reasonable price in a reasonable time frame is a huge problem? And this question is for those who do place a high value on so-called genetically appropriate materials. Do you find it very difficult or moderately difficult, not at all difficult to get the seeds you need? And then if you're someone who's less concerned with those issues of local adaptation and local sources and so on, again, the same question. Do you find it easy, difficult, somewhere in between to find the seeds you want when you want them in the quantities that you need? So we'll take a pause here while Sarah launches this poll, and then we'll see the results. We might have to just ignore, we might have to just kind of merge questions 2 and 3, but it sounds like most people are replying that they are very interested in genetically appropriate local material, which, you know, if I can express a personal opinion, I think that's great. And most people find it either very or moderately difficult to find the materials that they need, which suggests to me that our committee is working on the right track. We're addressing a problem that our audience members today are pretty concerned about, which I guess makes sense, but it's nice to know. And so thank you. Thanks for giving us that feedback. Okay, great. And the other thing I wanted to just conclude by pointing out is that you are welcome at any time to share your kind of more detailed thoughts with us. There's this email address that I'm showing here now, that is a comment address. And so that we know that your comment is a result of this webinar, please put NAA comment in the subject line. And also, if you want to just read the statement of task and other background information on our committee, it's available at this website. So thank you very much for being here this morning. And I think we have almost 20 minutes left for some Q&A, which will also be a great time for us to hear your thoughts. And thank you very much, Lisa and Sarah, for hosting this.
It's our pleasure, Susan. We're glad to be able to partner with your study and partner with the Plant Conservation Alliance and also with the National Seed Strategy.
Okay.
And I think you may have answered this question, but how do you measure the genetic appropriateness of a seed?
That's a great question, and that's one that I have to say personally I struggled with a bit in writing our report, because we were trying to put out some definitions and so on. And the way I would approach that is, I think that there are factual things you can say about seeds. You can say, are they source identified? You can probably say whether they're locally adapted. Do they come from the same seed zone? That kind of thing. Those are facts about a particular bag of seeds. Genetically appropriate is kind of an aspirational goal, and you get there by having local adaptation, etc. But it's not something that has a single way of measuring it. In fact, it's a multifaceted thing. Some parts of it are more knowable than others. You can certainly know whether something is source identified bag of seeds. You can know whether restoration is using the appropriate mixture of grasses and forbs and other functional groups and the right species for that site. It's very hard to know it's impossible really to know what the appropriate level of genetic variation for adaptation to future conditions is. So I think of genetically appropriate as this kind of goal that we're trying to get to, and some of the ways that we get there are through things like more attention to local adaptation in seed production. Okay, I'll go down the list of comments. I'll try to answer them all, but if there are too many, I might have to pick and choose, but I'll just start. One comment that is a sort of a question is, locally adapted does not equal native to a site. Comment. Well, yeah, I guess seed zones are the basic tool that's used to determine whether a particular seed source is appropriate for a site. And we don't always have good information about seed zones, and so that's one of the areas of research identified by the National Seed Strategy. But I guess the tool for getting to local adaptation is to identify seed zones that help us determine whether a seed from a particular source is appropriate to put at a location. It doesn't have to be the same location, obviously, but it generally should be in the same region, the same climatic regime. I hope that answers the question. There appear to be areas of the country that are easier to source genetically appropriate seeds than others. Do you find that to be true, and what can be done? That's a great question. It really goes to the heart of what we're trying to do. Our committee really arose in large part due to the perception of these large events. And one of the big things besides Hurricane Sandy was these large fires in the Great Basin, for which a lot of replanting is being done, or revegetation, whatever you want to call it, is being done. And that's just so different than the problems faced by urban areas, East Coast, the US Southeast. There are really great differences in the kind and scale of projects being done in different parts of the country. And in general, I think you could say there's a pretty strong distinction between the Eastern US and the Western US in terms of the degree to which there's a well-developed private industry supplying seeds for restoration. There seems to be actually, in general, much less of that in the East. And so I don't think we'll be taking a formal eco-regional approach in our report, but we are trying to cover some of those issues about geographic variation and trying to really understand if there even are any connections, if those different geographic areas and different sectors even really influence each other or not. But certainly, yes, there are very distinct problems in different parts of the country. Yeah, due to climate change, is there possibility that the seeds used to adapt it to the place may not be in the future? In that case, may we have to include the concern to the future? Wonderful question, and that's one of the ones that attracted me to participating in this committee, because the whole concept of restoration is having to I think be adjusted for the reality that there's going to be a lot of rapid change in the future, not only in mean climate values, but also kind of the scale of climate aberrations and kind of major climate events like heat waves and so on. And there's definitely active research going on and development in terms of how to incorporate both the traditional concept of local adaptation and the concept of need for adaptive flexibility into restoration. And so things like seed lot selection tools, if you're familiar with those, are helping foresters choose seed lots of trees that are adapted to predicted climates of the future. And so I think one of the approaches might be to combine those two things, to have seed lots that are a mixture of presently adapted and prospectively future adapted seeds. But that's a real moving target right now, and one that I think restoration is really struggling to get its arms around. It's hard enough, as we found in our study so far, it's hard enough to get a supply system working for just locally adapted seeds, and then to think about future adaptation and what to do about that makes it exponentially more complex. And so I hope that we'll get to touch on that in our report, but it's a cutting edge area.
Well, I was just going to raise this question so that our attendees can hear it too. The question is this: is the committee looking at state level efforts to increase regionally appropriate native seeds? For example, in Arkansas, they have a native seed program made up of local partners, and they're looking closely at systems in Missouri to model after.
Yes, definitely. We're trying to understand what states are doing, and also even regional to local entities are doing. And there's a lot of dynamism at those levels of government too. And of course, it's really variable from place to place. But we have some committee members who are very familiar with particular state level efforts. We have a committee member who's very familiar with some of the creative, innovative things going on in New York. A committee member who's been very involved in state level efforts in Utah. And we're trying at this stage of our information gathering process to reach out and pull in information so that we don't miss anybody, so that we can at least say something about those levels of government that are also trying to address this problem. Yes.
So here's another question to panelists. Do you have a feel for the main limiting factor regarding demand? Supply should be driven by demand in theory. How much of the demand is being limited by policy, or even more so culturally driven? Or is it simply a financial question?
Yeah, boy, that's a really big question. And so I think you're all aware this is a market that is never going to be 100% public or 100% private, right? There are many private seed producers. There are many private entities and nonprofits involved in restoration, but a great deal of the demand for restoration comes directly or indirectly from the public sector. It comes from laws and regulations and funding opportunities that emanate from the public sector. So it's always going to be an interplay between the two. It's always going to be and I think the stated hope of the National Seed Strategy is to have a robust private sector be very involved, although not exclusively involved, in the supply of seeds. But the demand is always going to be affected by public policy, always. And so, yes, I do think that there would be room, let's say, for our committee to recommend modifications to public policies that will improve the relationship of supply to demand, that will maybe improve, for example, the steadiness of these large demands from the public sector, which will make it easier for private sector producers to participate in the market. I hope somewhere in there I answered that question, but that is really at the heart of what we're talking about. Yeah,
I think that's a great answer. And I think, Susan, you also partially addressed another question that came up, and that is, this person is in West Virginia, where he says they have little or no supply available of native ecotypes within the state. Do you think it is feasible to attempt to grow native ecotypes on state-owned land with the goal of providing that seed stock to commercial growers in our state? So getting at this question of the relationship of public supply and industrial supply and demand in general.
Yeah, I mean, definitely in principle, in theory, that kind of thing is exactly possible. And I think it does happen in some places. For it to happen in any particular place, it's going to depend on your kind of your economic climate, your political climate that supports restoration. If that support is there, then yeah, that exact type of thing should happen. that wild collected seeds could be increased by private growers and sold to users, and then you would have the ability to do restoration with local ecotypes.
So this is a theme that I'm picking up in some of the questions. I think that there are folks wondering about the relationship of this study to urban plantings, urban supply issues, urban demand. Can you talk a little bit about that, how the study will potentially answer those questions within an urban context?
Yeah, great question. And fortunately, we have a committee member who's very focused on that area, Ed Toth from New York State, who's been really involved in the Sandy response and really involved in what's called the New York Greenbelt Alliance, currently trying to run a nursery in the middle of the COVID pandemic. But Ed's been really keen on keeping us focused on the urban part of the equation. And it's intrinsically, it's a harder part of the user community to understand because it's very diffuse, obviously, and totally different, potentially totally different from one place to another. But we do have some leads on appropriate, mailing lists that we hope to reach with surveys. There may be some sectors, I don't know if this will be true for cities or not, but there may be some sectors that because we can't get a kind of a comprehensive, representative, nationwide pool of survey respondents, we will have to simply proceed more by a kind of a structured interview type of methodology. The ideal is to have a statistically representative sample of respondents and then to give a formal survey. But if all you have is sort of piecemeal contacts, then I think the second best choice is to do more informal kinds of interview methods, structured interview methods. So that's exactly where we're at now, is asking for which of these sectors, urban, state, departments of transportation, nonprofits, for which ones of those do we have enough in-reach into the community, or is there a way to get in-reach into the community so that a formal survey can be done? And if not, we'll do something. We'll use that interview fallback strategy.
So here's another question, again, dealing with questions of supply. And the question is, native seeds can be grown out of the country at many locations where production costs are cheaper. This is risky with respect to weedy species. Requirements for certification are so important to include in specifications. So does the study include that possible supply plants that are grown outside of the U.S. and then are being brought in? They may be native at a regional level, but how is that accounted for in the study?
Boy, that's a really great question, and to my knowledge, it's not an issue that has come up in any of our discussions. The idea that things would actually be grown internationally, really fascinating possibility, and one where you can also kind of see the problematic red flags popping up, both in terms of the kind of the weed infestation problem and the need for certification, and also in terms of whether the right climatic conditions occur so that seeds aren't being grown in a totally inappropriate climate that will exert the wrong kinds of selective pressure on them. So no, that is not something that we've been, I think, aware of. And I would love for that person to send us a comment with some references to examples of that so that we can start looking at that, because it's absolutely relevant since it will affect the supply-demand equation within the US.
Yeah, we have someone who just typed in seed source for Southwestern projects are sometimes grown in Mexico. So that's an interesting example.
Yeah, please send us information on that so that we can investigate that. I'd love to see that. Thank you.
And again, touching on the demand side, Nancy is commenting that in the northeastern US, state DOTs, Departments of Transportation, are a key demand, creating key demand. And so she just wants to make sure that that's on the radar of the committee.
Yeah,
I believe,
absolutely. We've been reaching out and trying to get a comprehensive database on state DOTs, because we know that, yeah, they are really big. And we had two state DOT people speak to our communities. Can't tell you off the top of my head which two states, but they had very contrasting needs and issues. And so that was fun, and we have been investigating that.
I'm sorry, we're getting some very specific questions about seed cultivation for genetic selection. Yeah, and some state-specific examples, lots of discussion about economic models. So there's a lot of interesting comments here. I'll make sure to capture the chat for you, Susan, so you can refer back to it.
Thanks, that'll be super helpful. And I appreciate you moderating the questions too, because when I start to read them, they start flying across my screen, and I can't even finish reading them. It's hard to both think about somebody's question and read it at the same time.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in these webinars. So we're rounding down to the bottom of the hour. I just want to thank Susan again for presenting. I really enjoyed your presentation and the update that you gave us on the work that the committee is doing to assess supply and demand for native seeds across the country. I look forward to the interim report that's coming out and the recommendations when they're ready. Thank you everybody who attended. Thank you for all of your great questions and your comments, your suggestions. We really appreciate your attendance. We appreciate your participation in the polls. And again, all the comments and questions in chat. I will be sure to capture as many as I can for Susan and the committee, but do be in touch. You can email me directly, spears@naturalareas.org. You can also contact the committee through the webpage, which I posted in the comments earlier, and also I believe is in the flyer for the webinar. So thank you all. Thank you, Susan, and we'll be in touch.
If I could shout out a thank you or acknowledgement to the rest of the committee and the National Academy staff. They're fabulous, and they've done amazing work in the last 9 months on this project. So please give a little, round of virtual applause to them.
Yes, thank you to the entire committee that's working on this project. It's important work, and certainly important to the Natural Areas Association, our members, and our audience. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Have a great afternoon. Bye.
All right. Thank you again.